Sir, I need you to tell me exactly what you were doing inside that property.
I called 999 first. Then I went in because I knew she was inside and nobody else was going in.
You forced entry into a burning building without protective equipment and without waiting for us to arrive. Do you understand how dangerous that was?
I understand that. I also understand she was on the second floor and unconscious and the fire was in.
I know, I'm not going anywhere.
The relationship between Emmanuel Stephen and his next-door neighbors on Crestfield Avenue had never been warm. And on the evening the neighbor's house caught fire, Emmanuel would have been well within his rights to simply wait for the fire service and let them handle it. He didn't. He called them first and then went in himself because he knew a little girl was inside, and knowing that removed every other consideration from the equation. He came out with burns on his arms and the girl in his arms and was met at the door by her parents, who arrived 6 minutes later and told the responding officers that the black man standing outside their house had started the fire and was using the child to play hero. What those parents didn't know was that the truth was already documented, already witnessed, and already completely beyond their ability to bury. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. Here at JPTV, if you believe that a man who runs into a burning building to save a child deserves gratitude and not a lawsuit, then hit that like button and subscribe. Because we tell the stories that reveal exactly what kind of world we are still living in and exactly what it takes to do the right thing inside it. Emmanuel Stephen was 38 years old and had lived in the ground floor unit of 214 Crestfield Avenue for 4 years. Crestfield Avenue was a quiet residential street in the Renfield district, the kind of street where most people knew their neighbors by sight, if not by name, where the houses were close enough together that you could hear a conversation through an open window on a still evening, and where the rhythm of daily life was predictable enough that anything outside of it tended to be noticed. Emmanuel had moved to Crestfield from the other side of the district after a job change that brought him closer to the logistics warehouse on Industrial Parkway, where he worked as a shift supervisor. He was not a man who sought attention or conflict. He kept his garden tidy. He brought his bins in on collection day, and he exchanged the kind of nods and brief acknowledgments with his neighbors that constitute the basic social contract of a residential street, without ever becoming more than that. The exception was the family at 216 Crestfield Avenue, directly next door. Morgan and Claire White had lived there for 6 years with their daughter Lily, who was 7 years old and had the particular energy of a child who treats every outdoor space as a personal extension of her living room. Emmanuel had nothing against Lily. He had waved at her across the fence more times than he could count, and she had always waved back with the uninhibited enthusiasm of a child who had not yet learned to calibrate her responses to adult social signals. The problem had never been Lily. The problem had begun 18 months earlier over a boundary dispute involving a fence panel on the shared side of their properties. It had started as a practical disagreement about which side of the property line the panel sat on, and had escalated through a series of letters, a council mediation session that resolved nothing, and several exchanges that both parties would later describe very differently, into something that was no longer really about the fence panel at all. By the time the mediation process concluded without resolution, Emmanuel and Morgan White had stopped speaking entirely, and Claire White had followed her husband's lead with the particular determination of a woman who had decided that loyalty to her husband's position was more important than the merits of the original dispute. The fence panel remained where it had always been. The silence between the two properties remained where it had arrived and showed no signs of leaving. Emmanuel was aware, as neighbors are aware of these things without being told directly, that Lily was sometimes left with a babysitter on the evenings when Morgan and Claire went out. The babysitter was a young woman named Faye Creel, 19 years old, a second-year student at Harlow County Community College on Fenwick Road, who had been looking after Lily for the better part of a year. Emmanuel had seen her arrive on these evenings, always punctual, always pleasant with Lily in the way that good babysitters are pleasant, the kind of young woman who took the responsibility seriously enough that it showed. On the evening of Wednesday the 11th, Emmanuel finished his shift at the warehouse at 6:30, drove home along Industrial Parkway, and pulled onto Crestfield Avenue at 6:54. He noticed Faye Creel's car was parked outside 216 when he arrived, which told him what it usually told him, that Morgan and Claire were out for the evening and Lily was home with her babysitter. He parked, went inside, changed out of his work clothes, and made himself something to eat. At 7:40, he sat down at his kitchen table with his food and his tablet and began reading through the staffing reports he needed to review before the following morning's early meeting. At 8:17, he looked up from his tablet. The smell reached him before the sight did. Not strong, not the overwhelming smell of an established fire, but the particular thin, sharp smell of something burning that does not belong in the air of a residential street on a Wednesday evening. He put his tablet down and went to his kitchen window and looked out toward the back of the properties. What he saw was a pale thread of smoke rising from the upper rear section of 216 Crestfield Avenue, thin enough that it could have been dismissed as something minor, thick enough that it could not be entirely dismissed. He watched it for 20 seconds. In those 20 seconds, it became slightly thicker. He went to the front of his house and looked out toward the street. Faye Creel's car was no longer parked outside 216. He stood at his front window and processed what that meant. The babysitter had left, which meant either Morgan and Claire had returned early and he had not heard them, or Lily was alone in a house that was producing smoke from its upper floor. He looked at the driveway of 216. Morgan and Claire's car was not there. He went back to his kitchen and called 999. He gave the address, described what he could see, said he believed a child might be alone in the property, and was told that a unit was being dispatched. He was told to stay back from the property and wait for the service to arrive. He said he understood and ended the call. Then he stood at his kitchen window and watched the smoke at the rear of 216 Crestfield Avenue and waited. He waited for 45 seconds. In those 45 seconds, the smoke changed. It was no longer a thread. It was a column, and it had shifted from pale gray to something darker at the edges, and the window at the rear of the upper floor had taken on a faint orange quality that had not been there 45 seconds earlier. Emmanuel was not a firefighter and had no training in fire assessment, but he was a man who had been looking at the window of the house next door for 45 seconds and who understood, without needing a technical vocabulary to describe it, that what he was looking at was moving faster than the fire service was going to arrive. He went out his front door, across the short distance of pavement between the two properties, and tried the front door of 216. It was locked. He stepped back and hit it with his shoulder once, then twice, and on the third attempt, the frame gave and the door opened into the hallway. The smoke inside was immediate and present, but not yet overwhelming. It was coming from above, from the upper floor, and the hallway itself was navigable. He pulled his shirt up over his mouth and nose and went up the stairs. Lily's bedroom was the second door on the right. He knew this the way neighbors know these things, from years of proximity and the incidental knowledge that accumulates between two households, even when they are not on speaking terms. He opened the door and found her in her bed, on her side, with smoke already visible near the ceiling of the room and the orange glow from outside the window casting a moving light across the walls. She was not awake. He crossed the room, pulled the duvet away, and lifted her. She was 7 years old and light in the way that sleeping children are light, entirely surrendered to the arms carrying them. She woke as he moved toward the door, confused and then frightened, and he told her in the calmest voice he had available that she was okay and that he was taking her outside and that everything was going to be fine. He came down the stairs with her and out through the front door and onto the pavement of Crestfield Avenue, where three neighbors who had come out of their own houses in response to the smoke were standing and watching, and one of them already had a phone in his hand. Emmanuel sat down on the pavement with Lily in his lap and his back against the low garden wall and looked at the burns that had formed across the back of both hands, somewhere between the upstairs landing and the front door, and felt the full weight of what his body had been too focused to register. while he was still inside. The first fire engine arrived 4 minutes later. The paramedics arrived 90 seconds after that and took Lily from him with the efficient care of professionals who had assessed the situation before they stopped moving. She had burns on her left arm and her left shoulder, and she was frightened and disoriented in the way children are when they are woken suddenly into circumstances they cannot immediately process, but she was breathing and she was conscious and she was alive. Emmanuel's hands were treated on the pavement while the fire service entered 216 and began working on the upper floor. Morgan and Claire White pulled onto Crestfield Avenue at 9:04 in their car. They saw the fire engine. They saw the paramedics. They saw their daughter sitting in the back of an ambulance with a foil blanket around her shoulders. And they saw Emmanuel Stevens sitting on the pavement outside their house with bandaged hands and burns on both forearms. Morgan White looked at his daughter and then at Emmanuel, and the expression that crossed his face in the space between those two sights was not relief and was not gratitude. It was something else entirely. And it arrived so quickly that it told anyone watching exactly where it had come from and how long it had been waiting for a place to land. Morgan White crossed the pavement in 6 strides and went straight to the ambulance, where Lily was sitting wrapped in her foil blanket with a paramedic checking her left arm. He looked at her burns, and then he turned around and looked at Emmanuel sitting on the pavement with bandaged hands, and the particular expression of a man who had already decided what the story was and was now looking for somewhere to put it. He walked over to the nearest responding officer, a young constable named Dex Aldgate, who had arrived with the 2nd unit, and the conversation that followed was short and pointed and conducted at a volume that carried across the pavement without Morgan appearing to raise his voice. He told the officer that the black man sitting on the pavement was his neighbor, that they had an ongoing dispute, and that he wanted to know what exactly that man had been doing inside his house. The officer told him that, according to witnesses on the street, the man had entered the property to retrieve his daughter from the fire. Morgan told him that was not what he was asking. He asked again what the man had been doing inside his house. Claire White had gone to Lily and was sitting with her in the ambulance with one hand on her daughter's knee and the other pressed flat against her own chest. And from that position, she was watching her husband and the officer and Emmanuel on the pavement with the focused, assessing attention of a woman who was processing several things at once and had not yet decided which one to address first. Morgan came back across the pavement and stood in front of Emmanuel. He did not crouch down. He stood over him, which was a choice, and he said, "Why were you in my house?" Emmanuel looked up at him. He was tired and his hands hurt, and he had just carried a child out of a burning building, and he said, "Because your daughter was inside and the house was on fire." Morgan said, "How did you know she was inside?" Emmanuel said, "Because I saw your babysitter leave and your car wasn't in the driveway and the house was on fire." Morgan said, "So you broke into my house?" Emmanuel said, "I broke down your door to get your daughter out." Morgan said, "That's breaking and entering." The constable who had stayed within earshot stepped forward at that point and said that the situation was still being assessed and that he would need statements from everyone present before any conclusions were drawn. Morgan looked at him and then back at Emmanuel and then walked back to the ambulance to be with Lily. And the walk back had a different quality to the walk over, tighter, more contained, the walk of a man who had not finished with the conversation but had decided to continue it somewhere else. The fire was brought under control by 9:40. The upper rear section of 216 had sustained significant damage. The room where the fire had originated, which the fire service would later identify as the master bedroom, was largely destroyed, and the smoke damage extended through the upper hallway and into Lily's room. The structural assessment conducted that night confirmed that the lower floor was intact, and the property was not at immediate risk of collapse, but the family would not be returning to the house that evening. 3 neighbors gave informal statements to the officers on the scene that night. All 3 of them had been outside when Emmanuel went through the door of 216, and all 3 of them told the same story in their own words. They had seen the smoke. They had seen Emmanuel come out of his house. They had seen him try the door and then force it. And they had seen him come back out with Lily approximately 4 to 5 minutes later. One of them, a retired teacher named Gerald Osu, who lived at 211 Crestfield Avenue, directly opposite, had filmed the last 2 minutes of it on his phone, from the moment Emmanuel appeared at the front door with Lily to the moment he sat down on the pavement. Gerald had not been asked to film it. He had taken his phone out because he understood instinctively that what he was watching was the kind of thing that needed a record. Morgan White gave his statement to a senior officer later that evening, and the statement he gave described Emmanuel as a man with whom he had a documented dispute, who had entered his property without permission and whose account of events he was not prepared to accept without further investigation. He used the phrase "without permission" twice. He used the phrase "further investigation" 3 times. He did not use the word "grateful" once. Claire White's statement was shorter. She confirmed that Faye Creel had been looking after Lily and that she and Morgan had been at a restaurant on Aldgate Street when the fire started. When the officer asked her whether she had anything to add regarding the actions of her neighbor, she paused for a moment and then said that she would prefer to let her husband speak to that, which was its own kind of answer. Faye Creel was contacted by phone that evening and gave a statement the following morning. She said that Lily had fallen asleep at 7:15, that Morgan and Claire were expected home by 8:30, and that she had left at 7:50 after checking on Lily and finding her still asleep and comfortable. She said she had noticed nothing unusual when she left. She also said, unprompted, that she had seen the news about the fire and that she was grateful the little girl was safe and that she hoped the neighbor who got her out was being properly recognized for what he did. She said that last part in a tone that suggested she had already formed a view about whether he was. By Thursday morning, the story had moved beyond Crestfield Avenue. A local journalist had picked it up from the fire service's public incident log and had spoken to Gerald Osu, who had described what he had seen and had shared his phone footage. The footage was 41 seconds long and showed Emmanuel coming through the front door of 216 with Lily in his arms, moving to the pavement, sitting down, and looking at his hands. It showed none of the fire and none of the approach. It showed only the end of the rescue and the beginning of what came after, which was enough. The journalist filed the story that afternoon. By Friday morning, Morgan White had retained a solicitor. By Friday afternoon, the solicitor had sent a letter to Emmanuel's address at 214 Crestfield Avenue. The letter contained the word trespassing in the first sentence and the word damages in the third, and it was 3 pages long and left very little doubt about where things were heading. Emmanuel read it twice at his kitchen table, folded it carefully, and put it in a drawer. Then he picked up his phone and called a lawyer. The lawyer Emmanuel called was a woman named Petra Caulfield, a civil litigation attorney who ran a small but well-regarded practice on Whitmore Avenue in the Renfield district. She had been in practice for 17 years and had handled enough cases involving property, liability, and civic disputes to recognize within the first 10 minutes of her conversation with Emmanuel exactly what kind of case this was and exactly how it was going to go. She told him to bring everything he had: the call log from his phone showing the 999 call, photographs of his burns taken at the hospital, the paramedic report, and any correspondence from Morgan White's solicitor. Emmanuel brought all of it to her office the following Tuesday morning and laid it on her desk, and she went through it with the methodical attention of someone who was not looking for a story, but for a sequence of facts, which is a different and more useful thing. Morgan White's legal claim was built on 2 arguments. The first was trespass, that Emmanuel had entered the property without consent and without legal authority. The second was that Emmanuel's forced entry had contributed to the structural damage sustained by the property during the fire, a claim that was creative in its ambition, if nothing else. The solicitor's letter framed both arguments with the kind of confident legal language that is designed to make a weak position look stronger than it is, and it might have worked on someone who did not have Petra Caulfield sitting across the desk from them, reading it with 17 years of experience and a expression that said she had seen this before and was not impressed. Petra filed the defense response within 2 weeks. It was thorough and it was grounded in something that Morgan White's legal team had apparently not fully accounted for when they filed: the evidence. The 999 call log established that Emmanuel had contacted emergency services before entering the property, demonstrated not recklessness, but the opposite. The fire investigators' report, which was completed 3 weeks after the incident and which Petra obtained through a formal disclosure request, established that the fire had originated in the master bedroom from an unattended candle that had been left burning on the bedside table when Morgan and Claire left the house that evening. The report made no mention of any external cause and no mention of forced entry as a contributing factor to the fire's spread. The damage to the front door, the report noted in a single dry sentence, was consistent with forced entry from outside and was not structurally significant. Gerald Osu gave a formal witness statement that was 41 sentences long and left no gap in the sequence of events from the moment he first saw the smoke to the moment Emmanuel sat down on the pavement with Lily in his arms. 2 other neighbors submitted supporting statements. Faye Creel gave a deposition in which she confirmed the timeline of her departure, the condition of the house when she left, and the fact that Lily had been asleep and alone in the property from approximately 7:50 onwards. Her deposition also confirmed that she had seen no candle burning in the downstairs rooms when she left, which placed the unattended candle in the master bedroom and placed the responsibility for it precisely where the fire investigators' report had already placed it. The case was heard in the Harlow County Civil Court on Langton Street 4 months after Morgan White's solicitor sent the first letter. It lasted 2 days. On the morning of the second day, after Petra had finished presenting the defense's evidence, and before Morgan's legal team had completed their response, the judge indicated from the bench that she had significant concerns about the basis of the claim and invited the claimant's legal team to reconsider their position. They did not reconsider it. The judge dismissed the case in its entirety that afternoon. She found that Emmanuel's entry into the property had been lawful under the doctrine of necessity, that his actions had demonstrably preserved the life of the claimant's minor child, and that there was no credible evidentiary basis for either the trespass claim or the damages claim relating to structural contribution. She said one more thing before she closed the matter. She said it quietly and without looking up from her notes, in the tone of a judge who has something to say and has decided to say it, regardless of whether it falls strictly within the summary of findings. She said that the court hoped the claimant would take time to reflect on the full sequence of events that had brought this matter before it. The courtroom was very quiet when she said it. Morgan White said nothing publicly after the judgment. His solicitor released a single sentence statement saying that the family respected the court's decision and considered the matter closed, which was the kind of statement that people release when they have nothing useful to say but understand that saying nothing at all looks worse. Claire White did not release any statement. The family moved back into 216 Crestfield Avenue 6 weeks after the fire, once the restoration work on the upper floor had been completed by a contractor whose van Emmanuel had watched park outside the house every morning from his kitchen window without comment. The city's response came faster than anyone expected. The local council, having reviewed the court judgment and the full circumstances of the incident, opened a formal proceeding to consider whether Emmanuel was entitled to civic recognition and financial compensation for the injuries he had sustained and the legal costs he had incurred as a direct result of doing something that the court had already confirmed was both lawful and life-saving. The proceeding took 3 months. At the conclusion of it, the council voted unanimously to award Emmanuel a formal civic commendation and a financial settlement that covered his legal costs in full, his medical expenses in full, and an additional sum in recognition of the distress caused by the lawsuit itself. The total figure was reported by 2 local journalists who obtained the council minutes through a public records request. And when the figure print, it attracted considerably more attention than the original story had. Gerald Osu gave one interview to the local paper after the council announcement. He was 67 years old and had lived on Crestfield Avenue for 22 years. And he said that in all that time, he had never seen anything like what he had seen Emmanuel do on that Wednesday evening. And that the thing that stayed with him most was not the moment Emmanuel came through the door with Lily, but the moment afterward, when Emmanuel sat down on the pavement and looked at his burned hands with the expression of a man who had just finished doing what needed to be done and was only now allowing himself to feel the cost of it. Gerald said he had filmed it because he understood immediately that the world was going to need to see it, and that he was glad he had been standing at the right window at the right moment. Lily White recovered fully from her burns. The treatment took several weeks and left a faint scar on her left forearm that her parents were told would likely fade significantly over time. She was 7 years old and resilient in the way that children are resilient when the adults around them manage the situation well enough that the child is not required to carry more than her share of it. Whether the adults around her managed it well enough in the weeks and months that followed was a question that Crestfield Avenue had its own quiet opinions about, but kept largely to itself. Emmanuel went back to work at the warehouse on Industrial Parkway 2 weeks after the fire, once his hands had healed sufficiently. His colleagues had seen the local news coverage, and there was a card on his desk when he arrived on his first morning back, signed by everyone on his shift, which he read and then folded and put in his jacket pocket and did not speak about for the rest of the day. He was not a man who needed the acknowledgement, but he was a man who appreciated it. And the difference between those two things was part of what made him the kind of person who had gone through that door in the first place. He still lived at 214 Crestfield Avenue. He still kept his garden tidy and brought his bins in on collection day. The fence panel between the two properties was still where it had always been. Some things on that street had changed since the Wednesday evening when the smoke rose from the upper window of 216. Some things had not changed at all. Emmanuel Stephen had decided, somewhere between the courtroom and the council announcement and the card on his desk at the warehouse, that the things that had not changed were not his problem to solve and not his burden to carry. He had already done the thing that mattered. Everything after that was noise. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, because the man who ran into that fire didn't do it for recognition. He did it because it was right. Subscribe to JPTV and never miss a story that deserves to be told.